Friends, let's begin with the introduction. The topmost decision-making body of the WTO is the Ministerial Conference, which usually meets every 2 years. It brings together all members of the WTO, all of which are countries or custom unions. The Ministerial Conference can take decisions on all matters under any of the multilateral trade agreements. Friends, now let us have a look at the various ministerial meets held till 2015. Number 1. Singapore from 9th December to 13th December 1996. Second, Geneva from 18th May to 20th May 1998. Third, Seattle from 30th November to 3rd December 1999. Fourth is known as the Doha Round, started from 9th November to 13th November 2001. Fifth is the Cancun, Mexico Round, which started from 10th September to 14th September 2003. The sixth is Hong Kong Round, which started from 13th December to 18th December 2005. Seventh, Geneva, from 30th November to 2nd December 2009. Eighth, again Geneva, 15th December to 17th December 2011. Ninth, Bali, 3rd December to 6th December 2013. And lastly, Nairobi, from 15th December to 19th December 2015. Now let us look at an overview of all these ministerial conferences, their issues, decisions and controversies. The first ministerial conference of the WTO was held at Singapore, which is known as Singapore Ministerial Meet and Issues 1996. The Singapore Issues term refers to areas of trade and investment, trade and competition policy, trade facilitation, transparency in government procurement. It was at the first ministerial conference of the WTO held at Suntec City in Singapore in 1996. These issues were the first brought up as possible areas on which the multilateral body could initiate negotiations. In this round, they renewed their commitments to number 1. Fair, equitable and more open rule-based system. Number 2. Progressive liberalization and elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade in goods and services. Number 3. Rejection of all forms of protectionism. Number 4. Elimination of discriminatory treatment in international trade relations. Number 5. Integration of developing and developed nations. Number 6. Maximum level of transparency. The positive side of the meeting was the launching of the Information and Technology Agreement signed by 28 member countries, which aims at slashing tariffs on items of information technology to zero by year 2000. The first meeting was criticized for the manner in which its decisions were arrived at. There was a facade of consensus because most developing nations were marginalized in the decision-making process. Now let us look at the second ministerial conference. The second ministerial conference was held in Geneva in Switzerland, where the developed nations made a commitment to reduce subsidies and trade-distorting support to agriculture. Provision was made for special safeguard mechanism for the developing world, and the concept of food security was accepted for the developing nation. Now friends, let us look at the third ministerial conference. The third conference in Seattle, United States ended in failure because of many controversies between developed and developing nations. The conference failed to kick off a new round of trade talks. Now let us look at the fourth ministerial conference, which is also popularly known as Doha Development Round of 2001. The main issues of Doha Development Round are: the Doha Round was to be an ambitious effort to make globalization more inclusive and help the world's poor, particularly by slashing barriers and subsidies in farming. The initial agenda comprised both further trade liberalization and new rule-making underpinned by commitments to strengthen substantial assistance to developing countries. Apart from this, there was agreement on prevention of appropriation of traditional knowledge of developing world by corporations in West. Now let us look at the 5th Ministerial Conference. At 5th WTO Ministerial Conference held in Cancun, Mexico, the main task was to take stock of progress in negotiations and other work under the Doha Development Agenda. With Doha Development Agenda in place, it was expected that some concessions will be made on Singapore issues, but positions remained well established as they were. The only positive development from the point of view of trade negotiations was the creation and survival of the new developing country negotiating group, the G20. In particular, subsequent mini negotiations have seen the growing importance of members of the G20 like India, Brazil and South Africa. Nothing specific came out of the negotiations as there were disagreements on farm subsidies. Now let us look at the 6th WTO Ministerial Conference. The 6th WTO Ministerial Conference was held in Hong Kong, China in December 13 to December 18, 2005. 110 developing countries emerged as a powerful group against United States, European Union and other developed nations to fight for common interest of the least developed countries and developing countries. The main task before members in Hong Kong is to settle a range of questions that will shape the final agreement of the Doha Development Agenda, which members hope to complete at the end of 2006. The 7th session of the WTO Ministerial Conference in Geneva, Switzerland took place from 30th November to 2nd December 2009. The general theme for discussion was the WTO, the multilateral trading system and the current global economic environment. Now friends, let us look at the 8th WTO Ministerial Conference. The 8th Ministerial Conference was held in Geneva, Switzerland from 15th to 17th December 2011. In parallel to the plenary session where ministers prepared statements, 3 working sessions took place with the following themes. Number 1. Importance of the multilateral trading system and the WTO. Number 2. Trade and development. Number 3. Doha Development Agenda. The conference approved the consents of Russia, Samoa and Montenegro. In the final session, ministers adopted a number of decisions and the chair made a concluding statement. Now friends, let us look at the 9th WTO Ministerial Conference. This conference was held in Bali and is known as Conference Bali Ministerial Meet and Bali Package, Trade Facilitation and Peace Clause 2013. In Bali, trade facilitation was agreed to by all nations and for adjustment or adaptations to limits under agreement on agriculture. A peace clause was agreed at. Peace clause gave countries 4-year time to adjust to the limit and avoid sanctions. Date for ratification of Bali Agreement was 31st July 2014, on which India declined to ratify unless a permanent solution is reached. After this, in November, India-US reached understanding in which time limit of 4 years was removed and in return trade facilitation was agreed to by India. Trade facilitation deal was marketed by developed countries as a progressive and much needed deal for good of all type of countries. It is being said that it will boost up global GDP by $1 trillion and will add millions of new jobs. Trade facilitation along with special package is like saying that gains of developed countries will be so big that losses of underdeveloped countries will be lucratively compensated by them. Now let us have a look at the last ministerial conference of 2015, also the 10th ministerial conference of WTO, Nairobi Ministerial Meet 2015. Nairobi Meet was a huge disappointment for the developing and underdeveloped world. Here US trade representative considered calling Doha Development Agenda a dead, outdated and undesirable course. Its focus is now on Trade Facilitation Agreement, which was agreed to in Bali Meet. Further, new issues were introduced, including some Singapore issues, such as government procurement, e-commerce, investment, competition policy. To this, developing countries had strong objection. In the run-up to the Nairobi meet, a large majority of developing countries, led by India, China, South Africa, Indonesia, Ecuador and Venezuela, prepared the ground to ensure that the Doha round of negotiations are not closed by the two transatlantic trade elephants. They also tabled detailed proposals for a permanent solution for public stockholding programs for food security and a special safeguard mechanism known as SSM to protect millions of resource-poor and low-income farmers from the import surges from industrialized countries. Now, let us have a look at WTO and its role in agriculture. The WTO's agriculture agreement was negotiated in 1986-1994 Uruguay round and is a significant first step towards fairer competition and a less distorted sector. WTO member governments agreed to improve market access and reduce trade distorting subsidies in agriculture. In general, these commitments were phased in over 6 years from 1995, 10 years for developing countries. The Agriculture Committee oversees the agreement's implementation. The Agreement on Agriculture has 3 pillars. Number 1, domestic support. Number 2, market access. And number 3, export subsidies. Now, first look at domestic support. The first pillar of the Agreement on Agriculture, popularly known as AOA, is domestic support, which includes the classification of subsidies into boxes, depending on the effects on production and trade. Number 1, amber, most directly linked to production levels. Number 2, blue, production limiting programs that still distort trade. Number 3, green, minimal distortion. While payments in the amber box had to be reduced, those in the green box were exempt from reduction commitments. The Agreement on Agriculture's domestic support system currently allows Europe and the United States to spend $380 billion a year on agricultural subsidies. The World Bank dismissed the European Union and the United States argument that small farmers needed protection, noting that more than half of European Union's common agricultural policy subsidies goes to 1% of producers, while in the United States 70% of subsidies go to 10% of its producers, mainly agribusinesses. These subsidies end up flooding global markets with below-cost commodities, depressing prices and undercutting producers in poor countries, a practice known as dumping. Point number 2, market access. Market access refers to the reduction of tariff or non-tariff barriers to trade by WTO members. The 1995 Agreement on Agriculture required tariff reductions of, point number A, 36% average reduction by developed countries with a minimum per tariff line reduction of 15% over 6 years. Point number B, 24% average reduction by developing countries with a minimum per tariff line reduction of 10% over 10 years. Least developed countries, LDCs, were exempt from tariff reductions, but they either had to convert non-tariff barriers to tariffs, a process called tariffication, or bind their tariffs, creating a ceiling that could not be increased in future. Now, let us look at the third point, export subsidies. Export subsidies are the third pillar. The Agreement on Agriculture required developed countries to reduce export subsidies by at least 36% by value or by 21% by volume over 6 years. For developing countries, the required cuts were 14% by volume and 24% by value over 10 years. Now, friends, let us look at the implications of WTO activities for developing countries. Developed countries were behind the push for bringing in labor standards in the WTO, but developing countries were able to get the meeting to agree that the International Labour Organization (ILO) is the competent body to do such work. WTO is a body which provides opportunity to victimized countries to bring unfair trade practices to notice of dispute settlement body and to bring an end to such unfair practice. This dimension of WTO makes it a desirable and neutral body as it seeks to create a just global trading system. Several mechanisms have been suggested in order to preserve those countries. Number one being the Special Safeguard Mechanism, popularly known as SSM, and second, Treatment of Special Products, SPAs. Number 1. Special Safeguard Mechanism. A Special Safeguard Mechanism known as SSM would allow developing countries to impose additional safeguard duties in the event of an abnormal surge in imports or the entry of unusually cheap imports. In turn, the G33 bloc of developing countries, a major SSM proponent, has argued that breaches of bound tariffs should not be ruled out if the SSM is to be an effective remedy. A 2010 study by the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development simulated the consequences of SSM on global trade for both developed and developing countries. Point number 2. Special products. At the 2005 WTO Ministerial Conference in Hong Kong, members agreed to allow developing countries to designate an appropriate number of tariff lines as special products, known as SPs, based on food security, livelihood security and rural development. Now let us have a look at WTO and role of India in WTO. India has been a WTO member since 1st January 1995 and a member of GATT since 8th July 1948. India is one of the prominent members of WTO and is largely seen as leader of developing and underdeveloped world. At WTO, decisions are taken by consensus. India stands to gain from different issues being negotiated in the forum provided it engages with different interest groups constructively, while safeguarding its developmental concerns. Accordingly, India remains committed to various developmental issues such as Doha Development Agenda, Special Safeguard Mechanism, permanent solution of issue of public stockholding, etc. What was India's stand? On the issue of competition policy as applicable to hardcore cartels, India has pointed out that there is no clarity on whether these would include export cartels. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, is perhaps the best known example of an export cartel that rigs prices by fixing production ceilings. On the issue of transparency in government procurement, the Indian position is that while the principle is entirely acceptable, there cannot be a universal determination of what constitutes transparent procedures. On trade facilitation, India has argued that once again, while the idea is unacceptable, developing countries may not have the resources, by way of technology or otherwise, to bring their procedures in line with those in the developed world over the short to medium term. What is Indo-US WTO problem? Since end of Cold War, both countries have witnessed a spectacular improvement in bilateral relations in almost all spheres. However, at WTO platform, two countries have disagreements on issues in at least two important spheres: agriculture and intellectual property. Number 1 being agriculture. Agreement on agriculture AOA, which was hatched in Uruguay round negotiations, is heavily tilted in favor of developed world. For balancing this, India, as part of group of developing and least developed nations, the G33 group, proposed amendment to AOA in 2008. Current quest of G33 toward achieving permanent solution is follow-up story of this proposal only. As of now, peace clause agreed to in 2013 allows us to perpetually to continue our food stocking program at administered prices without being dragged into WTO for violation of AOA. Now let us look at intellectual property. As part of Doha Development Agenda, developing countries managed to twist agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property, popularly known as the TRIPS, in favor of developing countries by allowing compulsory licensing in certain circumstances. First compulsory license was granted by Indian Patent Office to NACTCO for Nexthavir, drug produced originally by German firm Bayer AG. Since then, US pharma industry has been apprehensive of frequent evocation of this principle in developing world. US not only want this concept to be done away with, it also wants a liberal IPR regime which allows evergreening of patents. Indian Patent Act has amended in 2005 allows protection of both product and process, but it allows patent only when there is enhanced efficacy of the substance. If a company reinvents a previously known substance into a new form, example from solid to liquid, then protection can't be granted. India, due to its promising pharmaceutical industry, exploits these powers religiously. Now let us have a look at India's gain from WTO. India has benefited from joining WTO despite the failures of two ministerial level conferences at Seattle and Cancun. Let us explain the gains India has achieved by joining WTO. Let us look at export and imports angle. According to the recent estimates, India's exports have almost doubled in less than a decade. Now let us look at exports of textile and clothing. According to a WTO agreement known as Multi-Fiber Agreement MFA, entire quotas in textile and clothing trade will come to an end from January 1, 2005. Till now, WTO agreement has required the member countries to phase out their existing quotas by December 31, 2004. It has further restrained them from expanding the size of quotas annually. These measures have helped India to increase its market access for its textile and clothing products. With effect from January 1, 2005, the entire textiles and clothing trade would get integrated into multilateral trade framework of WTO. Friends, let us look at gain in exports of software services. Further thanks to WTO agreement on free trade in services, India has become a world leader in software services which are contributing a lot to foreign exchange earnings and employment generation for Indians. Now let us look at business processing outsourcing services, BPO, business processing outsourcing services from USA and UK are coming to India, which have enabled us to earn not only foreign exchange but also to generate a large number of employment opportunities for educated Indian youth. But BPO to India and other developing countries are in accordance with the comparative advantage principle and raises profits of America companies which on being used. But BPO to India and other developing countries are in accordance with the comparative advantage principle and raises profits of American companies which on being used for further investment will generate more employment opportunities in the USA. Friends, let us conclude today's session. Developed countries wanted to include all these areas in negotiations. In contrast, developing countries wanted implementation of outcomes of Uruguay round. Hence, from very beginning of WTO deliberations, contradictions of interest of both developed and developing world came to surface, which continues till date. On issues like investment and competition policy, India feels that having a multilateral agreement would be a serious impediment on the sovereign rights of countries. These are concerns that many other developing countries also share. In absence of such a body, we stand to lose a platform through which we can mobilize opinion of like-minded countries against selfish designs of West. Thanks to vast resources of developed countries, they can easily win smaller countries to their side. WTO provides a forum for such developing countries to unite and pressurize developed countries to make trade sweeter for poor countries. Apart from this, dispute resolution mechanism of WTO is highly efficient. Countries drag their trading partner to this body when action of one country is perceived to be unfair and there is a violation of any WTO agreement by other country. Thank you, friends.